start now.
The question of the United States continuing its military involvement in Iraq to stop newly arising terrorist groups has been heavily contested since their initial arrival of Iraq in 2003. This topic was recently reinvigorated by the emergence of a new, brutal organization called ISIS. Both sides of the issue have valid points, but because American involvement has multiple economic, political, and ethical consequences for the U.S. and Iraq, it becomes much clearer that continued U.S. military campaigns will only create more problems and very few benefits. Ever since the U.S. military pushed Saddam Hussein from Baghdad, America became mired in an 8-year nation-building effort that failed to build a nation. Not only has the U.S. military involvement done little to help, it has also resulted in the deaths of over 500,000 people. Yes, terrorist groups in Iraq, like ISIS, can prove to be dangerous to the country as well as its citizens. However, before the invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2003, there weren't any prominent Iraqi terrorist organizations. And within a year of that occupation, the doors were flung open for terrorist organizations and terrorist acts. U.S. involvement actually increased terrorism rather than its goal of eliminating it.
One key justification for the American government intervening militarily in Iraq is the importance of Iraqi oil in the global economy. Presently, Iraq produces approximately 3% of the world's total oil and holds the 5th largest oil reserves in the world. If America could secure these resources, it would give it greater control over oil prices and an alternative means to gather oil. However, when terrorist organizations rise to power in Iraq, these oil fields and wells often become one of their primary targets. The groups will either destroy the wells so no one can use the resource, or try to capture the wells and gather from them so they can sell the oil and fund their organizations. They also target these oil resources because of their importance to other nations like America, knowing it will tempt them to send forces to try and protect the resource. It is a dangerous trap. These groups want to prompt a more major military response from America because it helps them achieve their goals. The more American troops that occupy Iraq, the easier it is for these groups to recruit followers under the guise of fighting an oppressive foreign power. It also makes the war more costly for the American government, as these groups use a strategy of financial attrition to combat America, and it's working. Ever since America's initial invasion of Iraq in 2003, they have cumulatively been spending more and more on the war each year. In a report done for the Council on Foreign Relations, Lee Hudson Teslake reported that by 2017, America's wars on terror will have cost the nation roughly $2.4 trillion. Those are tax funds that will not be spent on domestic programs to directly benefit Americans or simply be cut from the taxes they already pay. The few economic benefits of protecting oil supplies in Iraq are quickly overshadowed by the colossal financial burden America would have to endure.
About 6,800 Americans have died fighting in Iraq as of April 2014. Even the U.S. soldiers that make it home tend to be drastically changed, and 20% of soldiers who return from Iraq come home with post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. A study by the Department of Veteran Affairs reveals that every 65 minutes, a U.S. military veteran commits suicide. PTSD and these suicides often coincide directly with the experiences the veterans had as a soldier and the lasting effects of them. And yet, while the American death toll is a horrific number,
Oh no, I clicked it once, I did like two.
oh, you need to go back the other way. Yeah. And yet, while the American death toll is a horrific number, it doesn't even come close to the number of Iraqi deaths, military and civilian. Carrie Sheridan of the Huffington Post reveals that nearly 500,000 Iraqis, many of them civilians, have died due to the war the U.S. became involved in by invading Iraq in 2003. Official accounts only reach civilian totals of about 200,000, but when indirect deaths are taken into account, the numbers grow much higher.
In 2006, the National Intelligence Estimate concluded that U.S. counterterrorism efforts had backfired, causing a rise in global terror. Due to U.S. involvement in Iraq, the overall terrorist threat grew since the September 11th attacks. As the threat of terrorism increased, so did terrorist attacks, which can be seen in this graph. After the 9/11 attacks, the number of terrorist attacks in Iraq per year began to grow. The growth rate dramatically increases in 2003, the same year the U.S. military invaded Iraq. and the graph continues to grow through the years of US occupation. 60% of Iraqis and 74% of Americans believed US withdrawal from Iraq would be a positive advancement in 2012. American involvement in Iraq isn't popular for either nation's majority. So, increased military involvement would only lead to more anger and resentment. By fighting these terrorist groups in Iraq, the US government wouldn't be serving the majority of its citizens. It wouldn't be a voice of the people.
Instead of military involvement, it would be wise of the U.S. to partake in a coalition with the Kurds, a large Iraqi ethnic group that has been successfully resisting ISIS for years, while also protecting civilians of every ethnic group. The Kurds are described by Dexter Filkins of The New Yorker as pro-Western, largely democratic, largely secular, and economically prosperous, making them reasonable allies for the United States. The U.S. is currently supporting the Kurds with jets and weapons, while also warning companies not to purchase Kurdish oil. This is due to the fact that the Kurdistan desires to become an independent state, which threatens the American policy of one Iraq. The purchase of Kurdish oil would strengthen their economy, which could potentially pose a risk, as it might give them the power to become independent. Despite this, reversing the U.S. policy towards Kurdish oil is the United States' greatest chance at a solution. Instead of aiding the Kurds through weapons, the U.S. should give the Kurds economic support by purchasing their oil and encouraging other countries to do the same. This economic boost could give Kurdistan the power and motivation necessary to continue working towards Western goals in Iraq. This allows American goals to be accomplished without the presence of the American military.
Okay, let's start with you, Raleigh. As you were doing your research, what additional questions came up that you guys weren't able to fold into your paper and that you would maybe consider studying more?
Well, I know that the U.S. involvement didn't really just start in 2003. The history goes deeper, and so I wish I also would have gotten to focus even further back, towards World War II and just up until today.
Okay, but you felt like you couldn't do that because of limited time.
Yeah, and I just wanted to kind of focus just on a more direct topic.
Okay. Rose, how confident are you in the solution that you put forth in terms of its feasibility, in terms of political support for working with the Kurds and giving money to the Kurds and that kind of thing?
Well, when we were deciding on solutions, one of the biggest issues that we found is that a lot of other solutions still involve military involvement in Iraq, which is what we wanted to avoid. So we chose this one because it allowed us to be indirectly involved while still having the goals met. But there are some issues because if we give them political and economic power, they might have the power to break off into an independent state, which is really what the U.S. doesn't want. But they have been really strong allies of the U.S. for several years, and they've been really successful in fighting off ISIS and maintaining their own territory. And so the fact that they've been successful in the past, I think right now they're almost completely bankrupt, and they're still being successful in fighting ISIS. So if we increase their economic and political power, there's a good indication that they could be successful in completely eliminating ISIS.
Okay. Patrick, can you talk a bit about your research process, how it was split between the three of you, how well that worked for you, that kind of stuff?
Well, initially the way we broke it down had a lot to do with the individual research papers, so we each took it from a different lens, me being economic, and then ethical and social cultural. And that process worked very well for us because we felt it gave us a balance of perspectives, because we not only did by lens, but also we want you to take that lens and then look at both sides of the issue, someone who would argue for and against, which I thought gave us a very balanced view. And by incorporating the three lenses, I felt it helped us to have not just a one-dimensional view, but look at from multiple perspectives, which I think incorporate into our solution, since it's both economically feasible, ethically justifiable, and accepted from both cultures that are involved in the issue.
Very nice job again. Great job.